Welcome, everyone, and welcome to this plenary session today. So this session, as you saw from the title, is about unmet medical needs. And I personally love talking about unmet medical needs because every time and every single discussion on these is very different depending on who you talk to. And so today at RAPS, we assembled a great panel of 4 different stakeholders that each of them approach, live, and work on unmet medical needs differently. And what we're trying to do here today is have a collective discussion around what does this mean for us as a society, but also for us as regulatory professionals, because we work with unmet medical needs pretty much every day of our lives. We write briefing books, we submit applications with things that ultimately are addressing unmet medical needs, or at least that's the vision. And so here today we're going to discuss that, and then I will introduce all of you and will ask you to share your personal and also professional experiences in dealing with unmet medical needs. And I'll start with Dr. Justin West. Dr. Justin, thanks so much for joining us today. So you are a medical doctor and plastic surgeon, and you've worked a lot in research as well in that area, and you've also co-founded a foundation, KCNT1 Epilepsy Foundation, due to a specific personal reason and that influenced your professional journey. So can you share more about that and what unmet medical needs mean to you and the way that your career was shaped?
Sure. So I have a 7-year-old son, Andrew, the youngest of our 3 children, who was diagnosed with KCNT1-related epilepsy when he was about 6 months old. He was born phenotypically totally normal, and at 4 months had his first seizure. We were told he would be fine. Turns out that he has one of the most catastrophic forms of genetic epilepsy there is. At the time of his diagnosis, there were no therapeutics in development, and we didn't feel like we had a lot of options, so we started a foundation with the goal of driving research and drug discovery. So I run that foundation on the side of, in addition to being a full-time surgeon. To me, unmet medical needs is that 7-year-old son who probably right now is sitting in a high chair, in diapers, being spoon-fed because he can't do anything for himself. He's never spoken his first words. He has never taken his first steps. And he has a 50% chance of not being here by his 10th birthday. He's had a minimum of 50,000 seizures since the day he was born, despite being on 5 different anti-epileptic drugs at the same time, because there is no targeted therapy for him as of today.
Thank you so much, Dr. West, and thank you so much for sharing that personal account. And I think that illustrates quite a lot how personal stories like yours can fuel good advocacy and create, hopefully, momentum and impact in society for us to address those issues. Thank you so much for joining us today. So now I'd like to move to Karl-Heinz Humer. Karl-Heinz, who is a regulatory and scientific consultant, and has been in the past also a medical assessor at the Austrian Medical and Medical Devices Agency, AGES. And you've also been quite active as an assessor, and you have been part of committees at the European Medicines Agency, assessing numerous products under development and the evaluation of those products on the pediatric committee, but also on scientific advice. So providing really the agency input, hopefully to the successful development of products for unmet medical needs. So Karl-Heinz, tell us a bit about your career in that aspect, but also, of course, the sort of the former regulator, particularly a former regulator that saw many areas of pediatric needs, such as the one Dr. West just mentioned, being developed, having multiple efforts. How do you embrace the unmet medical needs, and how do you use it as a, I would say, as a tool in your daily areas and your daily work as an assessor?
Well, I would start from the very standard regulatory perspective. There is a disease, and then you have a licensing procedure, and then you approve a product. Full stop. That's the need covered. But in reality, it's of course much more complex. The basis of a license are data. It's information. And there's much more information than just for licensing purpose. And this additional information is of much more relevant. And that means I would define unmet needs data-based. There are gaps in knowledge, and you try to fill the gaps. Approval is one way, papers are other ways, and so on. And starting from there, there's a lot of holes and gaps in your knowledge, and we have to prioritize. How important are different informations? Is there anything available already, or do you compete with another product? How to show the benefit of your product compared to another one. And actually, I wouldn't care whether the intervention is a device or a drug. So it gets much more complicated. You also have to take into account for which purpose do you ask the question. And also in the regulatory context, there are a lot of different regulations and guidelines and so that use not exactly the same definition of unmet need, and there is this mirror term, significant benefit, which is something that you show to benefit someone or some group, and these together, I would say, I remember at least 6 or 7 different areas where that used is in a different context to prioritize, for example, funding, or to prioritize the most relevant endpoint, or to prioritize which comparator to need, because the information that you generate also has to be something, what does this offer compared to a standard of care or to another product? So, and then this, it's more interesting, of course, but that means in the end, this involves the whole study development. It involves really finding good solutions, what you want to show in a development. Very often, for example, endpoints are easy, standardized outcomes, not necessarily the one that are showing the most benefit, and for whom? For a prescriber, for a patient, for payers, so all these makes this a very complex discussion.
Thank you very much for sharing that. And I think that's why it's complex. The reason it's complex is why it's so fascinating to actually have those discussions with stakeholders like you. So thank you for sharing that account. We'll get to some of those points that you mentioned further in the discussion. Alison Komiyama, so Vice President for MedTech Innovation at RQM+. So Alison, you've also been an FDA reviewer in the past, but now you are actually quite dedicated in supporting device companies, doing really good innovation in trying to address as well unmet medical needs. And as Karl-Heinz mentioned, sometimes we focus too much on the pharmaceutical side of things. You know, unmet medical need is used quite a lot in the pharma drug world, but it's true that it's highly dependent on devices. We need good diagnostics and IVDs to ensure we understand disease and identify the right type of patients. We need all these new digital solutions that exist. So tell us a bit more about your current work and how you've seen from being an FDA reviewer to now supporting companies developing innovative devices. How have you seen them addressing unmet medical needs? And do they have the same understanding of what an unmet medical need is when compared to, let's say, pharmaceutical companies and sort of drug sponsors?
Oh, that's a big question.
I know.
I want to start with the definition because I think when I was first approached about joining this panel, I work on unmet medical needs, but I wanted to know how does FDA define it? And so you're right. I think CDER, which is the Center for Drugs at FDA, they have long been dedicated and have guidance documents about unmet medical needs, and we've seen a big push in CDRH, which is the Center for Devices. But if I may, an unmet medical need to FDA is a condition whose treatment or diagnosis is not addressed adequately by available therapy. This includes an immediate need for a defined population, namely to treat a serious condition with no or limited treatment, or a longer-term need for society, for example, to address the development of resistance to antibacterial drugs. And so, there are great examples of what FDA is really pushing to try to meet industry and also patient demand. That companies not shy away from these diseases or conditions that really need our attention. So some of the programs, we've talked about breakthrough designation in the past. I think we spent 2 days in the 510K workshop just talking about really exciting technologies that are being released and cleared and granted by FDA. One of them, which is, since we're in Southern California, one of my favorites, was for an autism diagnosis device. Cognoa is based here in Orange County. And it really, the issue was a lot of kids were not getting diagnosed early enough so that they could get the resources and the mostly the resources that they need to have a better outcome. So using AI and using algorithms, it's a purely software as a medical device, really to get that earlier diagnosis so that you could get the treatments that you need. So I think FDA's doing a lot. I'll talk more about it in the panel today. But yeah, it's very exciting times.
Thank you so much for sharing those examples as well, Alison.
Yeah.
Welcome. So, Cheryl, first of all, congratulations again on behalf of Critical Path on the patient-centric award. Let's wrap all of this that you've heard from a patient perspective. And you work a lot with clinical outcome assessments. And we did hear Karl-Heinz mention about the importance of getting the right endpoints, exactly to address the right unmet medical need. What is the importance of clinical outcome assessment and these type of tools for our mutual and collective understanding of how to operate with unmet medical needs actively? And what is Critical Path doing in that area?
I actually want to answer an unspoken question before I get to that one,
Please.
which is what I do. I love COAs, clinical outcome assessments, but just hearing the three panelists so far, to me, you hear we need the bench scientists to be discovering the molecules that are actually going to help. We've heard that we need the right endpoints and being able to collect the right data. And then we also need the right diagnostics to recruit the right people and know that we're targeting in the right way. And the big picture across all of that, COAs is a piece of that, but it's collaboration. It's making sure that all of those different silos are actually speaking to each other. They don't need to be at the same table doing their work together, but they need to be having conversations. And here we have a room full of regulatory specialists, and you're a critical component to that as well. If you're not able to have your conversation with the people who are discovering the drug and the people who are designing the study and the people who are actually creating the recruitment criteria, you can't turn that into the evidence-based package that needs to be submitted for review and for ultimately, hopefully, success. So that big picture, collaborating across all those different silos is that big piece. In terms of COAs, that's how we figure out, is the drug actually helping, or is the therapy helping? I'm putting the drug hat on, but we have a lot of ways that we can help people, including devices. And COAs are how we figure out, are people actually feeling better or functioning better with this new therapy? That's ultimately what we want to know. If there's a biomarker that's underlying that we can measure, that's great. But the biomarker can change, but maybe the person receiving the therapy hasn't seen the benefit yet. We've got to tie it to when and how they see that benefit and put it into their own words so that they know when they go to their doctor that they can make a decision on, should I take this new therapy or not, because the information is available for them to make that decision on together.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that. And shedding light also about what you do as well a bit more with Critical Path on COAs. And so you did mention something interesting, which is, we need to put into their perspective, in their language. And again, I think this is a bit what we're trying to do here in this session, is really, we all, in a way, have different languages and goggles to look into the concept of unmet medical needs. We have definitions from regulatory agencies that sometimes are a bit siloed in certain areas. And I wanted to ask you, looking back into a definition, or what we use unmet medical needs for. We typically usually hear, well, when we do benefit and risk assessment, mostly of drugs, but also devices, we look into how patients live, especially how patients survive, and how patients function. And there's also how patients feel, having quality of life and patient perspectives into the mix as well, or even carers' perspectives into the mix. So sometimes these have very different weights, right? Sometimes we have areas, like we said, rare epilepsies where there's nothing targeted. There's a lot of efforts, but unfortunately nothing really effective. And other areas where there's actually a lot of things approved. There's actually a lot of medicines, but there's always this residual unmet need. There's no curative treatment. There's a lot of symptomatic aspects, but they don't really address a lot of the outcomes. So I wanted to ask you, how can we assess these three aspects objectively using unmet medical need? Is there an ultimate way that you can objectively, as stakeholders, define what an unmet medical need is, essentially? So maybe, Karl-Heinz, I can give it maybe to you first, because I know, particularly in pediatrics, there has been, and we discussed in Europe, there is a known list of pediatric unmet needs that has been put up, which is essentially a list Do you think that we can end up having a list or a catalog of unmet needs that sponsors can go to say, yeah, this one, okay, I'll go to it?
I would not be too optimistic. Maybe pediatric is a good starting point, because whatever you use as an endpoint probably needs some adaptation to be acceptable for a pediatric population, whatever it is. Some measurement, some patient-reported outcome. So you have to be quite specific, actually. And that needs a lot of dialogues with children, with the parents, with the healthcare providers, and formalistically having something sounds nice, but very often might miss the point. So it's really kind of a stepwise back and forth. So one problem I have seen very often, so you agree on an endpoint and you try to be consistent, and other companies should show the same outcome. Nice, because that makes them comparable, but they might have different benefits. A different endpoint might better address what another product can do. So the standard finding something that you think you agree needs modification, needs adaptation, because there's always more than one need, and let's find really as maximized as possible individual approaches to assess different interventions, also different time lengths, also different subpopulations. So I am rather unoptimistic that simplifying standardizing that is a solution. That's, for example, the EU Commission with all they want a unified definition. I think it misses the point, because it's not that easy.
Sure. And maybe we can go then to Dr. West, if I may, because again, you, as also a patient advocate, you do need to communicate this, of course, to researchers, the investor community, to really shed light into, the disease and what it means. And I think you articulated in a very personal level, what does it mean for you as a parent? You mentioned, all the things that you're experiencing as a family. How do we articulate, and how we actually create the language that is effective from an advocacy perspective to highlight how do we put the right unmet medical needs in front of the key priorities, because it's about prioritization as well. How do we do that effectively as an advocate?
Well, I think one of the topics that came up earlier was just communication, communication across silos. So I think that we've been doing this long enough to see that there's often a substantial disconnect between the very intelligent people who are working diligently to solve our problems and what the end user patient really experiences. So, and it leads to sort of barriers for participation. So we've been invited to natural history studies where the whole premise of the construction of the design of the study was untenable because it required substantial travel, which for patients like ours is nearly impossible. Fortunately, we've been able to provide really good feedback and get pharma to come back, and that conversation translated into the first fully remote natural history study that this one company had ever done. But the point was communication, and I think what I have suggested to most of the pharma executives that we now work with, we've got over 20 programs now around the world working on KCNT1, is that at the end of that board meeting, when you whiteboard out what the diseases are that you want to add to your pipeline, one of the first calls should be to the foundations who represent those patients. Because if you spend 5 years building out a natural history study or working on a drug, and then you develop something that has where the mechanism is going to have a certain impact, but that impact is not important to the patient, then what was the point? You're not going to recruit me to a drug that does something that you think is important that doesn't resonate in my household. So it turns into a waste of time and money. So I think that it never occurred to me to bring regulatory into the beginning, but the fact is you probably should build the team that represents every element that needs to go into a drug development package or a technology development package from day one, and get those people working together. And one of the key things there, I think, that you'll get is trust. Because you can put all the time and money into a device, and you can put all the time and money you want into a drug, but at the end of the day, if those patients, especially in our community, our community is full of people who have essentially given up because we lose a child every month. Our kids are in and out of the ICU, in and out of the hospital. My son spent over 100 days of the first year of his life in the hospitals. I understand why his drugs don't work, because they don't target the mechanism, but our average parents do not get that, and it doesn't matter how many times I say it, all they recognize is that their attempts have failed. I think that if we start with trust and making everybody in the landscape a stakeholder early on, so that everybody gets to know everybody on all sides. Right now, there's often in our world, there's an antagonistic relationship, at least in theory, between patients like us who are desperate for drugs and regulatory, who we look at as a massive hurdle that we're going to have to fight. That's the wrong way of looking at it. What we should really be looking at ourselves as partners to say, okay, we all recognize this disease is terrible. How can all the elements in that landscape work together on a common purpose? And then you'll build trust, you'll get recruitment, and then you'll change lives.
Thank you so much for that message. And I think it's also a great message for a lot of regulatory professionals thinking about the patient perspective, even when we start defining those regulatory strategies that ultimately will lead to, hopefully, an approved product, patient information, and all that. Thank you for sharing that. Alison, any thoughts on this? So again, from a device world, of course, benefit risk is a bit different from when we look at it from a drugs perspective. But as you mentioned, these aspects in the way that we use devices not only to better identify patients, but also to be part of this development journey to curb unmet medical needs. How do they play on this different weighing system of perspectives for patients?
Yeah, and well, one of the words that you said was feel, right? Because it's the live, the function, the feel. And I think there's a lot of effort into patient preference, looking at what actually works for that family in particular. FDA's put out, and I have to give a kudos to Dr. Michelle Tarver, who's now leading CDRH, really helping with accessibility, making sure that, and they've started the initiative as home as a healthcare hub. COVID, for all the things that were horrible about it, it also, I think, was a wake up to our community that telehealth is something that we are underutilizing. If you can keep yourself from having to get in a car and drive 5 hours, and back to the diagnosis of autism, kids would have to drive 5-10 hours to go see a doctor, a specialist, and by the time they're there, they're all fried from being in a car for so long. Maybe they don't get the diagnosis because in their home, in their with their parents and with their families, that's when the diagnosis should be made, and that's what the device does. It allows the patient and the caregiver not to have to leave the comfort of their home. So I think FDA is pushing that a lot, but I think also the patient advocacy groups have been amazing, really trying to make sure that their voices are heard. I always like to, when I have a lot of FDA meetings, and sometimes we'll walk into the room and say, we all have one thing in common, and I think it's true for this room too, is that we are all patients in this room. Maybe not all of us have an unmet medical need, but we will definitely know or love someone that does. And so even at FDA, everyone at FDA in that room with me has been a patient or will be a patient, and we have to come at these problems together, or these, looking for answers in a way that's constructive, in a way that we can say, how do we work together on this? Because we all do have the same goal, which is to help these patients and to find treatments and diagnoses for them earlier.
Thanks, Alison. So Cheryl, we're talking here also about these specific outcomes as well, how the patient survives, how the patient feels. And again, in your work, of course, you do research, and Critical Path has done a lot of remarkable work on understanding how these things impact benefit risk. Now, can we actually future-proof those measurements a bit more actively? How do we attribute different weights to these things when we talk about unmet medical needs? Because again, as we mentioned, we have a lot of an input of patient preference studies and a lot of great groundbreaking work on getting that patient perspective into drug development. Whereas in many areas, we're still relying quite a lot on survival data and a lot of other outcomes that are a bit much more hard outcomes. So how do we manage that in the context of unmet medical needs for you as a COA expert?
The challenge there is the number of stakeholders that need to get information from a clinical trial. And as Justin was speaking, I was thinking about the way that we design our trials and how that is just so foreign to the patient community. And so why are you not measuring this thing that really matters to me? Well, it's really distal from the therapy that we actually are evaluating. And so I was just thinking about education there and really trying to explain why we do randomized control trials and why we don't just do everything open label, everybody gets something and they know what it is. It's that, that's I think where the objectivity comes in. But to the stakeholders, some people are looking for the clinical trial to be able to look at the primary endpoint and assess efficacy. Some are looking for health economics and is the cost benefit financially advisable. Some, it's the patient preference of, are the risks worth the rewards? And so how do you decide kind of the order of the hierarchy and what goes in, what doesn't go in, especially in the time of lean protocols? I know that teams are trying to take things out, not put things in. And if the decision maker out there who has discovered lean protocols and asked for everybody to do those, if they're here, please put more things in, not take things out, because there's all these different stakeholders who need information, and if something that's coming out of that clinical trial protocol, you might miss a critical piece of evidence to move the needle for that person. It might be a regulatory authority, it might be a reimburser, it might be a patient who needs this piece of information to be able to decide what to do, take this or take that, and now they don't have that information because it's not in there. So this, I think, comes back to the collaborative environment. And at Critical Path Institute, we do have collaborations across sponsors, across patient groups, and the regulatory community. And so we've got a number of stakeholders that are at the table, all making good decisions collectively so that everybody can go back to their own trials. And it doesn't mean plug and play. It doesn't mean everybody goes and develops the same trial, because it really matters about your personal context of use, your target product profile. But that information should be able to inspire that endpoint hierarchy. It should inspire what goes in, what can remain out, thinking about all those different stakeholders in mind.
That's a great segue, and I think what you mentioned now touches a lot on what Dr. West said in the beginning, which is trust. And it is true that when we have 15 different stakeholders looking at the same data, the same protocols, the same endpoints, of course there will be divergences in interpretation. But I think that's also where the regulatory action has a lot of weight, because we do need to be the ones, again, this is also a call for all of us, we need to be the ones that also advocate we need to do development programs that can, in the modern age, fulfill the requirements of as many stakeholders possible. And I think if I go back to what you just said, and going into the elephant in the room, how do we, so unmet medical needs, it's difficult to define. I think that's something we discussed today. It depends on the stakeholders we work with and we talk to. But how do we firewall a bit the scientific and sort of the medical interpretation of what the medical needs are, knowing that it is so linked to sticks and carrots and incentives and rewards, because that's one of the key issues as well, where collaboration is really needed. Of course, it drives investment, because we need that clear identification to drive development to sponsors and to sponsors to participate. But do you think there is a collaborative way to create that trust that Dr. West mentioned, if we firewall that from all those perspectives? Because it is true, and again, I'll stop, it's a very big segue. but it is true that we tend to look at unmet medical needs as, okay, this will get regulatory approval, but it will not give access. So then patients ultimately will not benefit from it. So it's a very siloed system. So how do we break those silos actively as stakeholders? I don't know if any of you would like to.
Can I just give a huge kudos? I'm a big fan of Critical Path. And one of the things you guys did that stands out to me is in 2001, you hosted, it was, as you said, industry, FDA was there for the SHIP MD, which is the Systems in Hospital Innovation in Pediatrics. And it's really bringing those stakeholders together and starting those conversations, because it shouldn't just, each one of these things shouldn't happen in a vacuum or in its own silo. We really do need to be talking about what worked for another product or what's worked for other unmet medical needs. And so, yeah, kudos again on the award, but I just think those are the conversations that need to happen. And I do, FDA, for all their faults, they have some great stuff that they're doing. One of them is the Consortium for Pediatrics. There are 5 nonprofits that they fund to help fund pediatric innovation. So also making sure that it doesn't just get granted or approved or cleared at FDA, but that it actually is sustained and it stays on the market. It's able to succeed. Any pre-market submission to FDA for a pediatric device is free. If you're under 22, if your population is under 22, especially if it's an unmet medical need, consider applying for breakthrough designation and then submit your free application. So FDA is really trying to provide incentives to focus on these populations where I think most companies wouldn't touch them with a 10-foot pole because it wasn't, financially a good idea, or it was too dangerous. What if my device hurts this child? That's going to, end up on Netflix, right? So really trying to reduce the fear that I think a lot of manufacturers have approaching these populations.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Some of these incentives, that's a little bit artificial systems, whether it's a carrot or a stick. For example, definition of an orphan, 200,000 less. That doesn't really make sense. You try to formalize, but you want really tailored solutions. And that, again, I like that you have to be much more specific. What I see very often, patient input, we ask them. That means you have covered the topic, but it's completely different that you really have a dialogue with them, that you listen to them, that you learn, and that's something that's not exactly the same. So I've seen a lot of, for example, in scientific advices at the European Medicines Agency, many patient representatives are introduced there, and they make maybe a good proposal, also depending on their background. So people like you are perfect to have the background as a parent and an expert. But that means you have to take that into the next general reconsideration, what you want to show, how high is the priority for that, and so on. So having just checked the input of something, or also again challenging what people think is already agreed on, is not always appropriate. You really have to continuously challenge whether what we did for 5-10 years still is the most relevant thing we should look for. There's so much opportunity to improve by looking at other things.
Yeah. And so we heard here about trust, which I think underlines everything, because that trust can create that dialogue, that collaboration, that stakeholder cross-fertilization, because again, these are topics that are quite intertwined with clinical, regulatory, medical, patient inputs and patient advocacy. What else do you think is missing for us, particularly as regulatory professionals? Of course, there are many stakeholders, but as all of you that are in the audience are working in regulatory, if you had one message for the audience to take home on this and to be game changers in how we do better with this dialogue, what would you say to the audience? Would you like to start, Clara?
Yeah, I think my answer also answers the last question, which is beginning with the end in mind. And the end are the people who are going to benefit from the therapies being developed. So starting by understanding their perspectives, understanding what's going to help them make a decision on if you've developed something that's effective, what do they need to see in that to be able to take it and to know that they should be receiving benefits from it in terms of how they're feeling and functioning. And if you can identify that and keep that as your litmus test as you go along in your research paradigm, you can kind of step backwards on all the different stakeholders that you have to consider to get to that last final ultimate stakeholder who's the most important of all of them.
Thank you. Alison, would you like to
Yeah,
share final words?
Closing statements. I'll end with another example. And I do have permission to speak about this particular client. And it's one that's really near and dear to my heart. And it speaks to an unmet medical need. I found out through this project that every 15 seconds, a baby is born addicted to opioids in the US. And one of the projects we had been working on is a device, medical device, neurostimulator, non-invasive, that helps adults get through opioid withdrawal symptoms. And so that's part of the hardest thing to get over opioids is the 7 days before you can enter the medical assisted therapy. And so they usually don't make it through those 7 days. They relapse, there's a lot of issues. And this device essentially allowed them to make it through and reduce those symptoms in order for them to get the treatment they need. It was groundbreaking, really exciting. FDA was excited about it. But then they decided, hey, why don't we take this into the pediatric population? And so they've been doing clinical studies with amazing success. We applied for breakthrough designation at FDA. And so to your question, having those conversations with the stakeholders, with FDA, because they are absolutely involved in the development and the progress of your clinical study. And FDA gave it breakthrough designation. We now have multiple sprint discussions with the agency, and we're working now on the de novo application for it because it is a different risk. A huge shout out to Fern AI, which is one of the things that my company does to really author the documents to support the de novo. So maybe keeping your eyes open to new technology and new methods to help regulators make the right and wise decisions. So no one wants to get something on the market that's unsafe and not effective, no snake oil here, but really, having those conversations early with the appropriate stakeholders and then keeping your eyes open to all the different technologies to try and help advance that pathway.
Thank you, Alison.
Yeah.
Karl-Heinz, quickly?
Yeah, you mentioned I'm regulatory and scientific. So most regulatory people that approach me see their requirements fulfilled, yes, no, and often are then a bit surprised that I challenge them on things outside. So get out of the box. It's really more important to have a dialogue than, okay, we would have to ask that our clinicians. Yes, please involve your clinicians in our discussion here. This is not to separate. It has to be done integratively.
Thank you, Karl-Heinz. And Dr. West, finally?
I would take it a step further and say even our KOL physicians usually don't understand our disease because they don't live at home with the patient. And it was one of our KOLs who we all adore who designed that ridiculous program where all of us were going to have to fly to Rochester, New York. So what I would say is, take advantage of meeting the patients in the places that we show up to, our conferences, show up to our family conferences the same way we have our pharma folks showing up. A program we initiated a couple years ago is the 24-hour challenge. When I realized how few of our pharma execs understood our disease, I said, come to my house, try taking care of my kid for 24 hours, change his diapers, pick him up, and you will understand the basis from which I fight for my son. And I would extend that same invitation to everybody in this room who wants to learn about my disease.
Thank you so much, Dr. West. Please join me in giving a great round of applause to this fantastic panel on today's session. Thank you, everyone.